So as I was saying, I wanted to introduce my friend, Bob Wolf. He is actually a member of our board of directors here at Hillel at UCLA. And he's also a member of our Hillel Forever Legacy Society. And our Legacy Society is something that, as we look forward, a lot of us have been very future facing as we see ourselves in this present time. We want to make sure Hillel happens forever. And the Legacy Society is basically a way that all the people that care like you about our students, about these community offerings to perpetuate throughout time can help ensure that that happens. And basically legacy giving is preparing in your will or your estate or through various different forms, thinking about how Hillel can be a part of your legacy. So Bob is one of our friends who has decided to put Hillel in that framework in his life. And so he's going to share for just a minute or two about his experience and why it's important to him. And then he's graciously allowed me to cut him short so we can continue learning together. So Bob, are you ready to speak?
I'm good to go.
Okay.
I'm good to go. I'm the Hillel board member that time forgot. I think I've been on the board since the 90s. It might be a advertisement for term limits. But
we can't hear you.
I said this might be an advertisement for term limits. I'm the board member that time forgot. Can you hear me now?
Yes, of course.
Okay. So this is to be trite, the holiday that talks about light in times of darkness, and I just wanted to briefly mention one of the silver linings for me about the pandemic, which is started me thinking about my own mortality and vulnerability. That I didn't. Not only do I not have a family, much of a family, I have some family, but no kids, and I never had a will or never did any estate planning. When I came back to LA after going away for college, Hillel at UCLA with its brand new Rabbi Chaim became a really important source of community and Jewish values for me, especially when I kind of felt bereft of the college experience, and primarily because of the teachings and the values that, like the teachings that we're about to hear. So I thought, as I'm finally doing my estate planning, umpteen decades later, I thought, what better way for me to ensure Jewish continuity, to make sure that there's an institution like Hillel there for future generations of UCLA college-age students. So Hillel is the primary. I don't know if any members of my family are listening, but Hillel is my Hillel is getting what I got after I'm gone, and this is a lesson I learned from my mom. She ended up giving a very significant part of her estate to Hillel. There's a tree outside that has a little plaque with her name, and in the decade since her death, I've been surprised. I really have how much this is a gift that keeps on giving rather than feeling robbed. I really feel enriched, and I feel her spirit every time I come into the UCLA Hillel building. So during the holiday, we're all looking for menorahs and candles that we can light. I just wanted to share my own experience about this is a really important way to keep that stuff shining in the world.
Thank you, Bob. Oh, wow. That was wonderful. And obviously no need to cut you off. I guess I want to say something, just a frame. There are a lot of people whose faces I see here, whom I know over the years, who, like Bob, have not only learned, but have really been teachers themselves. And I think that's something all of you should think about. How you've taken what you've assimilated and then translated it and create on your own. That's the nature of a community. That the learning doesn't cease, and it's not about there being only one source of learning. That the fact is that all of you have that potential. And it seems to me that's that is what the power of Torah is, if you want to talk about power in those terms, that it generates more light, and the light is inexhaustible, because learning is something that when you take it, you also can give it. So it's not a zero-sum game. So thank you for joining in with the learning, and keep on doing so and transmit it as well. That's what I can say. Thank you, Bob. You're one of those lights. Okay. So those of you who were with us last week, I just wanted to make two comments, and just a sort of a summary comment. One is that I think I emphasized the fact that the legend of the vial of oil appears or is sustained in the Babylonian Talmudic tradition. It emerges from Babylon, and it's not an accident. It's not from Palestine, from Babylon, because Babylon was a place where magic was very significant. Those of you who know a little bit about art know about the magical bowls, inscriptions. People wrote magical formula on bowls and buried them in front of the entrance to their homes, and that was a form of protection. So we have many bowls with Aramaic inscriptions from Talmudic times, and also there are lots of legends in the Talmud that reflect on magic. And I also did mention that the Zoroastrian religion was a fire religion, and when Doreen and I were in Azerbaijan, I recall going to a Zoroastrian site where there was fire emerging from the ground. So you had a sense that there was something magical about that world. So it's not accidental that you have a legend of fire that is contextualized in the Babylonian Talmud. That's number one. Number two, and related to this idea of fire, it might be that lighting the menorah is a type of ritualized invocation of God's miraculous fire on the altar, because we had this passage in Maccabees that recalled Nehemiah's attempt to sort of rekindle the flame, the divine flame that had been transmitted, and it's on the altar. We no longer have an altar; we have the menorah, and the importance of the miracle story is a way of saying that this light, it's not our light, it's the light of God that we're bringing into us and we're bringing into the world. I think I actually think that's a very sort of powerful image in terms of what we're doing. Now, let's see today how Maimonides handles Hanukkah. Before I go on, I just want to mention again, just a little advertisement, because some of you like the music. The music that you heard was produced and written by John Simon on an album called Hanukkah and All That Jazz. I'm sure you can find it in many different places these days. And he really does a wonderful job. So now the great problem for Maimonides is basically our problem. He's uncomfortable with miracles. The project, the Maimonidean project, is demythologizing Judaism, and he has to deal with popular religion as it surrounds him, a lot of magic that people believe in, and he wants to teach people how to be religious devotees without depending on the notion that somehow God is present at their beck and call to do all sorts of things for them when they need him. And that's the nature of what religion is. You're in the foxhole and you need God. Maimonides wants people to love God even when they're not threatened, and to sort of understand the joy, simcha. I mean, that's the phrase that's used technically in relationship to presence, and that you have also in Chassidut, in joy, the joy in the notion of something, of being in the presence of transcendence, and of recognizing that which is somehow beyond in the world itself in which you live, as something that's aspirational and achievable. So that's a problem. What do you do with this miracle? Number one, I mean, the holiday is a real problem. Second problem is, all right, so it's not a miracle, it's a military victory. That's also not such an easy one. Not that Maimonides opposed, a military defense or even a victory and the necessity of going to war. I mean, he lived in a Muslim world, and he also, he read Aristotle. He understood the nature of governance and the need for there to be, for there to be protection. But he was very concerned about the arrogance of power. As a philosophic and religious teacher, it really was at the heart, it seems to me, of his endeavor, and the corruption that power brings to religion. The effort was to limit that in some way, to acknowledge it and to limit it. We'll see how he does that. And I would claim that in doing so, he was reading the rabbinic tradition correctly. Now, there's a general question, which we're not going to discuss, but you can all ponder this question. And those of you who want to do further study and reading, you can look into this. There was an article written years ago by a great historical Talmudic and historical scholar, Gedaliahu Alon, which was Hahishkitha Chachamim et Hachashmonaim. In sort of in colloquial English, did the rabbis forget about the Hasmoneans, or did they forcibly forget? And that is that they erased them from the tradition because they're not meant. There's almost no mention in the Talmud. You'll see today just a small mention. We wouldn't know it. And I told you last week that Judah, who is really the hero, is not mentioned at all. So what happened to the Hasmoneans? Was the tradition suppressed? Were they opposed to the Hasmoneans? So we're going to see some questions, at least in the way in Maimonides' formulation, how he recognizes this difficulty. The general consensus these days, sort of the scuttlebutt among scholars, is that it's not such an extreme conclusion, that it's not that they forcibly suppress the tradition. And I mean, I'm not going to go into that now, but as I said, there are many articles, especially by modern Israeli historians, writing about this question, both in Hebrew and in English, that you can consult if you're interested. And finally, I want to say that this teaching in Maimonides that we're going to read today is a great example of Maimonides' general methodology. His work, the Mishnah Torah that we're going to read, which you could translate as the second Torah or supplemental Torah, is a work of law, 14 books that organize the full range of Jewish law. This passage that we're reading today is the conclusion of a section called Zmanim, or seasons, which deal with the holidays. And it's not an accident that the conclusion is homiletic and philosophical. That's part of the project. How do you inject, as a philosopher and as a legal scholar, a halachist, how do you inject philosophy into law so that law is not practiced, observed in a mechanical way, but that people get the idea that it's about values, it's about ideas, and that the law only is a concretized means of reaching those ideas. And those ideas, by the way, are often, if not always, if they're valuable, universal ideas. I mean, this is a revolutionary reading of Judaism. I know maybe for moderns, it's not so uncommon to think in these directions, but Maimonides sort of set this enterprise, and he was completely immersed and embedded in the tradition, for sure. But this is how he read it. And I think that this passage is a great example of his methodology. We'll see that, how he does this, as I said, demythologization, and a reflection also on David Hartman's approach. David Hartman was himself very committed Maimonidean, and that sort of helped him develop his worldview. Okay, so let's begin. And I think everybody has the sources. I'm going to share the screen Oh yeah, I don't know if I, 1 second. I think I have to find my sources. Hold on, give me a second. What are we calling it? Radical reformulation. What is it? Hold on, everybody. On the radical reframing. Okay. Excuse me. I don't
For
know.
the title too.
I don't have it. 1 second. I know that I.
I'm trying to pull it up too. And
Yeah. So what if you pull them up? That would be fine. Because I don't seem to have it here. No. Have you pulled it up?
yeah,
Okay. So
just
can you
loading.
post it on? Will I be able to? Can you want to post it on the screen?
Yes,
Share
I
it?
can. And
Okay.
I can also send it to you if you prefer that.
No, it's okay. If it's
Okay.
there, I can, and I have access to it. So you'll move it. Can you move down, please, to page 4?
I'll do my best to keep up with you. You were like
All right.
a marathon runner.
Okay, fine. On the top of the page. Sorry.
A 4,
Okay.
right?
So it's actually no next previous page, please, and the previous page. 2. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Actually, yeah. Let me start with this. Good. Source number 2. Okay, my friends. So we're going to start not with Maimonides, but with the Talmud. So the Talmud reads as follows. What is the reason for Hanukkah, of Hanukkah? The famous question, my Hanukkah, which could be actually read for those of you who want to be, read it in a plausible way. What is Hanukkah all about? All right. Ditanu Rabbanan, our rabbis taught on the 25th of Kislev, commence the days of Hanukkah, which are 8 on which a lamentation for the dead and fasting are forbidden. We saw this last week from the scroll, the fasting scroll. So this line actually in the Talmud is in Aramaic. It's very old. It's the oldest layer of the Talmud, and is parallel with early Mishnaic Tannaitic sources in the first couple centuries. For when the Greeks entered the temple, they defiled all the oils therein. Notice what's missing here. It said, what's Hanukkah? What's the reason for Hanukkah? Then it goes right into the Greeks entering the temple and defiling the oils. I thought there was a war. I thought there was a struggle. I thought there was persecution. Ma korekan, what's going on here? Nothing mentioned at all. Judah, Maccabee, nothing. For when the Greeks entered the temple, they defiled the oils therein. And when the Hasmoneans, here it's mentioned, the Hasmonean dynasty prevailed against and defeated them. So it does mention that there was a defeat, but they made search and found. But again, I just want to emphasize what I said earlier. There's no sense that Jewish life was threatened other than that the temple was defiled. It doesn't mention persecutions. It doesn't mention, what the prior battles that occurred. And when the Hasmoneans prevailed, they made search and found only 1 cruse of oil, which lay with the seal of the high priest, but which contained sufficient for 1 day's lighting only. Yet a miracle was wrought therein, and they lit the lamp therewith for 8 days. The following year, these days were appointed a festival with a recital of Hallel and thanksgiving. All right, the following year took a year, and we know this from the book of Maccabees that the Hasmoneans wrote letters, and the festival was accepted by Jews all in Egypt, I guess all over the Mediterranean, which was the world for them in those days. Okay, so this is the source. This is the primary source in the Babylonian Talmud. This is the story. This is the miracle, and this is the 8 days of oil. Okay, can we go back now to source number 1? Giselle, please, to the top. Thank you. And I'm going to do something. I want to please be patient with me. If you could, those of you follow, I'm going to read it in Hebrew. You follow in English. I'll try to read the translation as well. All right. So I'm starting the first paragraph. Because one thing you should know is Maimonides is Hebrew. Those of you who have some Hebrew, even basic Hebrew, he wrote beautifully. He created a language in the Middle Ages for his work, and his linguistic skill is noted. All his other works were written in Arabic, in Judeo-Arabic. This is the only work written in Hebrew that he composed. And you know, there's a basic reason for it, because he wanted this. This work was authoritative. He wrote it in the language of the Torah and of the Mishnah to carry on the tradition of rabbinic authority. The Bayit Sheni in the Second Temple, Tishemalchei Yavan Gazru Gezerot al Yisrael, when the kings of Greece, and he's referring to the Seleucid kings in Syria, issued edicts against Israel. So here Maimonides gives you the background missing from the Talmud. He has the Talmud in front of him. I suspect that he, like many others in the Middle Ages, knew more about the background of the Maccabees, not because he read the book of Maccabees. Remember, the Jews did not read the book of Maccabees. Even Maccabees 1, which was written in Hebrew, right? Even Maccabees 1 was lost in Hebrew. It existed in Greek. And maybe, I don't know whether it exists in Latin as well. It may have in the Middle Ages. It didn't exist in Hebrew all those years. What existed, and by the way, Maimonides did not read Greek nor Latin. He knew Aristotle and Arabic, right? So what he may have read, which many others in the Middle Ages read, was a work called Yosipon, and it's spelled Joss, I think Ipon. You can find references to Yosipon. Yosipon is a work that was written in the Middle Ages by a quasi-historian who says that he had read Josephus and was presented as if it were a Josephus, except that he was named Yosef Ben Gurion, who was a famous fighter in the war of, not in the War of Independence for the State of Israel, but in the first revolt when the temple was destroyed in the year 70, between 66 and 70. So Josephus would have written about him, but Josephus's name was Yosef ben Matityahu. Josephus, the son of Mattathias the Kohen. So this work presents a lot of information from Josephus, and it was available certainly in France, in Ashkenaz. I know that. In the hands of rabbis, and it must have been available in the medieval world as a source of Jewish history. So Maimonides knows something about the background. Ubitlu datam, you see the language here I think is important. And they attempted to annul their religion. This was a religious persecution. They didn't allow them to study the Torah. And I see the English says observe the Torah. La'asok b'Torah is the blessing that we make in the morning before we study Torah. So la'asok, to be busy with Torah, is not just to observe, it's to learn in order to be able to be observant. La'asok b'Torah uve mitzvot, and in observance of the commandments. Upashtu yadam b'mamonam, and their hands extended into their wealth. Ubidnotehem, and their daughters, meaning maybe it's referring to rape, or they intermarried, and there was forcible persecution, and there was theft of the wealth of the Jews, theft of the temple as well. They entered the temple precincts. Upartsu bo pratzot, and they enacted in the temple abominations. How is it translated here? And they oppressed them greatly until, this actually wrought havoc within and made the sacraments impure. Abominations. The timu hataharot. They defiled what was pure. I mean, there are all sorts of stories about sexual violations. That the altar was defiled by an idol, etc. So it was devastating to the Jewish religious practice. The tsar lahem liYisrael ma'od mipneihem. And it was a great suffering. Great sorrows befell the Israelites, the Jews, because of the Greeks. Ulechatzum lachatz gadol. They pressed them, they oppressed them, they persecuted them in a great way. Ad sherichem, now here. Ad sherichem alehem Elohei avotenu, Boshim. Until Too far. Go back a drop. Go back. I don't know it all by heart. Okay, good. Until the divine, I see he's trying to keep up with the English, had compassion on them, right? And redeemed them from the Greeks, v'hitzilam, and saved them. V'gavru b'nei Hashmonai, and the Hasmoneans overcame, and they heroically rose up and defeated the Greeks. And listen to the phrase, b'nei Hashmonai hakohanim hagdolim, the sons of the Hasmonean family, the high priests, v'haragum, and they killed them, meaning their oppressors, v'hoshiu Yisrael miadam, and they saved Israel from their hands. And they established v'ha'emidu melech, and they established a king from one among the priests, and the monarchy, sovereignty returned to Israel for more than 200 years until the destruction, ara chorban hasheni, until the destruction of the temple. Okay, let's Giselle, why don't you just scroll down to all of paragraph 1. Okay, we have all of paragraph 1. All right, let's discuss it. What's Maimonides doing here? So first of all, you notice the following, something puzzling. He talks about the fact that the Hasmoneans won a victory. But before he gets to the Hasmonean victory, he says, Richem alehem Elohei avotenu, how God of our ancestors had mercy upon them. Now, I want to ask you something. Maimonides, who's the last one in terms of his reading of scripture, even his reading of the Bible, to say, God did this, because he is absolutely opposed to all anthropomorphisms. So every time he comes across an act of God, he has to see it in symbolic terms, or he has to interpret, he has to overinterpret in another way, rather than attribute an act to a direct divine intervention. So what does it mean here? And what does it mean that God had compassion and saved them? He uses the term v'hoshiam, that God saved them, and then he says that the Hasmoneans overcame and slew them and saved them. So who saved? Was it the Hasmoneans or was it God? So here is already everything in a nutshell. I mean, this is Maimonides. Right? Remember, I told you he was wary of the abuse of power. He was also wary of attributing miracles to the divine. So that's not what he means. But he requires some understanding that human agency and achievement, right, have to be tempered by a sense of humility. Tzimtzum. You know the word tzimtzum? Tzimtzum is used in the Kabbalah to talk about contraction, right? A sense of self-limitation. This, I would say Maimonides might agree with this type of formulation, even this formulation, which is a little bit exaggerated, but let me allow it, a little exaggeration. We won. We did it. Baruch Hashem. You hear me? Should I say that again? In other words, because this is not a lesson about Hanukkah. It's a lesson about life. I had this discussion with my friend the other day. What does a doctor do, the surgeon do, as he or she enters the operating room? Do they say, "I'm going to, who am I? I'm going to do this," right? And it's me, or is there a sense of trepidation that a human life is in their hands, and they go into the operating room with a sense of awe? I'm not saying they have to believe in God in a classical way. They have to know that they're not God. Remember, that's the principle. So that's what's going on. In the Maimonidean formulation, the Maccabees have to be cut down to size, so that what he does is he precedes his description of the Maccabean victory by introducing the divine. Not that God intervenes, but that there's a reading of history. History is read in a way that there's a sense that human beings achieve this, but it's not just an expression of power, and it's not all about victory. It can't be that, because that leads to a sense of arrogance and abuse of others. And indeed, we'll see in a moment. In fact, I'll give you an example right now. So in my collections, maybe I've used this before in the past. Among the ephemera that I've collected regarding Israel is this Haggadah Ha'atzmaut, the Haggadah of the Day of Independence. And this Haggadah was written by an Israeli novelist in 1952 as a special commission for the army. When the chief rabbi of the army in those days, Rabbi Goren, got wind of this Haggadah, he made a beeline to Ben Gurion's office, and he laid down an ultimatum. It's either the Haggadah or me. And Ben Gurion decided to remove the Haggadah from circulation. So 10,000 copies were removed from circulation and supposedly buried. I don't know how I got one, but someone dug it up. And Rabbi Goren remained as the chief rabbi. Now, what did he oppose? All right, it doesn't mention God's name. It talks about there are no blessings in this Haggadah, and it's all about the establishment of the state of Israel in the context of the language or of the spirit of the Passover Haggadah. But I think that the nature of Rabbi Goren's opposition or severe opposition was a consequence of the following paragraph. This is the paragraph, and you see the insignia of the Israeli army right here in this page, and it reads as follows. I'll translate in English. You'll be familiar with it. Not by an angel, not by a seraph. It's a famous passage in the Haggadah when we say that there was no messenger who saved us, but God alone saved us. And that's why, right, Moses is not mentioned in the Haggadah, because it can't be a human being. That's the Maimonidean point. We don't attribute ultimate salvation to a human being. We say it's God, even when humans are involved in the action, for a sense of a self-limitation, so that we not be carried away with our own, with a sense of our greatness. So what was written in this Haggadah is, not by an angel, not by a seraph, not by a messenger did we defeat the enemy, but through the Tzva Haganah Yisrael, through the Israeli army. So this is precisely the example of the arrogance of power that Maimonides wants to avoid and wants to limit and wants to rejects, because he understands what results from a sense of belief in oneself and the history of Jewish suffering at the hands of rulers who said, it's me, I'm great. So he constructs our understanding of Hanukkah as this combination of sort of the divine element, a divine consciousness that we have in our achievement. That's the thing. It's a matter of consciousness. It's a matter of understanding. It's a matter of sort of self-limitation that we carry with us in life. It's an expression of the verse from Zechariah in the Haftorah that we read on Shabbos Hanukkah, Lo b'chayil, you know this, not by might and not by power, but by my spirit. I'm gonna read you a take from David Hartman's writing, or a summary of David Hartman's writing as follows. In the introduction to his book, A Heart of Many Rooms, Rabbi David Hartman describes his excitement following Israel's famous victory in 1967 and his desire to mark his exhilaration in some substantial way. Feeling that Jews would lose the powerful significance of the experience of the Six-Day War, he relates, I went enthusiastically to my teacher, to my Rav, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, with this request. This was Hartman, with full chutzpah. He says to Soloveitchik, proclaim a religious festival. Proclaim God's revelatory presence in history. Must God only be revealed in stories? Can we not celebrate the living God of our directly felt redemption? So Hartman's telling Soloveitchik, look, we have all these stories from the past. None of us experienced it. And it's hard, we don't even know historically what happened in antiquity. We know that there was a Six-Day War. Make it a holiday. Finally, we have something in our lifetime that we can celebrate as an act of God. Tell us that that's what it is. Hartman explains that Soloveitchik referred him to the Talmudic passage, the passage that we just read, which reports that the festival of Hanukkah, celebrating the Maccabean military victory and the miracle of lights, was not proclaimed immediately after these wondrous events, but rather only in the following year, pointing out the significance. Remember the end of the passage? It took a year for the Maccabees to enact the holiday, pointing out the significance of the following year, quote, Soloveitchik counsels his student to pause rather than reacting in the heat of the moment. While Hartman writes that Soloveitchik's sobriety and restraint were out of tune with his own feelings of enthusiasm and passion, that's the point. Our passion and enthusiasm, our sense of our achievement, drives us in a romantic way, to celebrate what we have done. And Soloveitchik says, stop. The role of religion is to restrain. We obviously don't know religion that way, because we've seen religion that's intoxicated by power and by its access to power. That's the problem. Religion has defiled itself once again in our time, as it has done throughout history. It's a very how should I say? It lends itself, unfortunately. All institutions lend themselves this way, especially those that have influence over a lot of people, right? So Hartman, with all his enthusiasm, right? Soloveitchik put a stop sign. So Hartman, the writer writes, Hartman later admits that following the shock of the Yom Kippur War in '73 and Hartman's rediscovery of what he terms the age-old experience of Jewish history, which is uncertainty, loneliness, isolation, and the concern for survival, he felt like writing to Soloveitchik and saying, perhaps you were right. We must wait for the following year before giving an enthusiastic response to events in history. Now, let me say something more about this, because this is a cornerstone of Hartman's theology. And that is, he basically maintains, under Soloveitchik's influence, that Judaism is not an event celebrating religion, that religions, that historical events are not loaded with theological significance. It's not the event, it's the meaning that's determinative. It's the symbolism, it's the value. And we don't dance around the particular actions and achievements. That's one of the problems that we see today with fundamentalist religion that reads the Bible as a scorecard for contemporary history and identifies events that occur these days as being some biblical events. And then they declare that God is present. God is present in the way in which we live, and God is present in our values. Now, this is a very difficult way of being to transmit. I acknowledge that. And I always say, who said it was easy to be a religious person or to be a Jew? That's a mistake. And in fact, religion is intended to confront us and challenge us rather than make it easy. To make it easy, we would celebrate ourselves. We love that. I mean, we're great. Instead, religion says, as Soloveitchik does, have self-restraint. Right? You need breaks. You need to develop those breaks. Right? So Rambam starts right away framing how he's going to approach Hanukkah as this intersection and tension between a sense of the divine, a consciousness of the divine, and the human behavior, the human achievement, the human victory. Now he goes on, and you see the problems that unfold, because he calls the Hasmoneans the high priest. Now I don't know what I tell you, if someone can find me a source, I'll celebrate. I don't know the source. I know the following, that Mattathias that the Hasmonean family, the Maccabees are a priestly family. I also know that they're a minor priestly family in the sticks in Modi'in. They're not in Jerusalem, they're not a Jerusalem-based family, and they're not in the traditional line of high priests. We know that for a fact. So what is he saying? And not only that, usually you want to say it's the children of the Hasmonean high priest. What do you mean high priests? There's only one high priest. Did he mean generations of priests? I just don't understand what he's referring to, unless what he's doing here is he's actually articulating part of the tension here, that these priests assume power. Look what he says in the next line. They established a king. That's a violation. We know that because the Bible demands, or we seem to understand the Bible as demanding a separation of powers. There's the sacred realm, and then there is the governmental, I don't even like to call it the profane realm. There, right? And the king is in a realm distinct from the priest. Not only that, the king is subject to the law in the same way that all Jews are subject to the law. And in some ways, the priest is a higher authority, as being, at least in antiquity, the one who represented God, whereas the king represented the people. And the king had to subject himself to God's law. You know that. I mean, I don't know if you read Deuteronomy, you know the king has to carry a Torah scroll under his arm at all times. I mean, it's an ideal. It's not I don't think it was never achieved, and kings violated this all the time. But you see the attempt. The Torah is trying to confront the power and present us with an image of power, of rule that has a sense of self-limitation, as an ideal to be aspired to, and that we should look up to as a possibility and as a critique of the way in which we do govern ourselves. And then he says further, it seems to me that it's a bit of a what, how you translate a shtick. He's trying shtach to the Maccabees. They ruled over Israel for more than 200 years until the destruction. Is he trying to tell us that maybe his opposition to the Maccabees is that in the end they were as corrupt as those rulers who bought the priesthood that they attempted to replace, and that they in fact brought destruction upon Israel in their mode of rule, and that they themselves were involved in the purchase of the high priesthood and in bribery, and in fact inviting Rome into Jerusalem, and then ultimately leading to Herod becoming the king. You know this, by the way. You know, Herod was an Idumean. Who are the Idumeans? They are the descendants of Edom, right? Edom is the family of Esau. So they're relatives. Now, the Idumeans lived on the boundaries of Jordan, basically I think around Transjordan in the south of Israel. And the Maccabees in their ventures, when they did establish a monarchy, it was in the generation after the brothers, or maybe it was the youngest of the brothers that established the monarchy, I think. No, it was John Hyrcanus, so it was one of the sons. And he conquered a vast territory. They became a little bit of an empire, and they forcibly converted the Idumeans. That's what happens when you abuse power. The result of the forcible conversion is that Herod assumed the monarchy and entered into the family of the ruling family. And so perhaps Maimonides is blaming the destruction, ironically, on the redeemers who redeemed Israel from the hand of the Syrian Greeks, eventually became the oppressors of their own people. Possibly. Okay.
Hi.
Yes.
Do you, we have a few questions. Are you on a roll, or I just thought I found an opening?
I'll take a question, because I don't allow people to ask usually, because I speak too much. So it would be good. Give me two questions, please.
Okay, I saw a question from Ruth, and I saw a question from Norm.
Yes.
Let me see if I can.
I'm unmuted.
Well done, Ruth.
Hi. Like everybody else, when I was a kid, I went to Hebrew school, and Judah Maccabee and his bunch were these big heroes. It wasn't until much later that I was in college that I did some research, and I found out that Judah Maccabee and his group killed not only the Greeks they were fighting, but they were also killing fellow Jews who are not religious. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, all right, just a little bit. So we don't know the extent yet. Yes, there were, I think I can say this much. Judah did not intend to kill Jews who were not religious because they were not religious. That's not an accurate portrayal. If he killed fellow Jews, it was because they fought against them. They joined the opposing forces. They did not, as far as I know, they had their hands full with defending themselves against the Greek forces. And you know, all those depictions they had, there was some, I think there was certainly at least one battle in which the elephants were brought in as part of the I don't know, the cavalry. I don't know what you would call it for the Greek army. But you know, I think that's a stretch, that they actually set about to kill heretics. There may have been Jews who joined forces with the Greeks, and they would have fallen to their in battle. So I think that's probably more accurate. And there were, remember that even after Judah's victory, Menelaus, at least from as far as the book of Maccabees is concerned, Menelaus, who had bribed his way to the priesthood and was not a part of the Oniad, of the priestly, of the high priestly family, and maintained his role as the high priest. See, that's what's so striking about, you know, these passages. I just saw Norm's question about Mattathias. Even after Judah was victorious, well after Mattathias was dead, right? They didn't claim the high priesthood. They claimed neither the monarchy, Judah did, nor the high priesthood. Menelaus was maintained as the high priest. It was years later that they cleansed, and that they pushed him out. He was forced to leave. So there's no evidence that in the family there was a tradition that they were the high priests. They were priests who assumed the role of the leadership, and they were victorious. And then they assumed the role of kings as well in the later generations. Okay, so that's number one. And I saw Norm's point here about Al-Hanisim. It's true that in the Al-Hanisim, in the prayer that refers to the miracles, we refer to Matityahu Kohen Gadol. So I'm corrected there, but it's not. But I can tell you that, and it is mentioned in the Talmud. Yeah, it is mentioned in the Talmud, but in the Midrash, Matityahu was only called a Kohen. So I just wonder what this tradition is really all about, and it is an attempt to, at some point, to make them into more significant religious figures than they were, and at the same time, not to talk a lot about them as military figures. Okay, let me move on. Can I have my screens, please?
Yes, thank you, Chaim.
The second, all right, and I actually want to move on a little more quickly. Okay, when the Jews, all right, paragraph number 2. I'll read it in English, okay? So we won't have to. Here, why don't you move down, scroll down, please. When the Jews overcame the enemies, here, that's it, and destroyed them, they entered the sanctuary. This was on the 25th of Kislev. Okay, we know that because the 25th of Kislev was also the day on which the sanctuary had been defiled by the Greeks. A pig was brought as an offering on the altar. They could not find any pure oil in the sanctuary. This is Maimonides writing. It sounds like the Talmud, with the exception of a single cruse. It contained enough oil to burn for merely 1 day. They lit the arrangement of candles from it for 8 days until they could crush olives and produce pure oil. What's missing, my friends? Read it for yourself. They couldn't find any pure oil in the sanctuary, with the exception of a single cruse. It contained enough oil to burn for nearly 1 day. They lit the arrangement of candles from it for 8 days until they could crush olives and produce pure oil. Giselle, you want to unmute everybody just for a second? If we can unmute everybody, can everybody shout out what's missing here in this?
The miracle.
The miracle. Exactly. The miracle is missing here. Maimonides, that's what I'm telling you. He talks about God's intervention, but when it comes to the miracle, he doesn't call it a miracle. It's as if he.
Now you're muted.
Now you're muted.
What happened?
It's as if what happened was you had 1 day of oil supply and it lasted for 8 days. Sometimes things like that happen. Even to you, it happens. So Maimonides says it's possible that what they call a miracle was natural. I mean, why make it into a miracle? The oil lasted a long time. What's this all about? All right. So that's very striking that he omits the reference to it being a miracle. And what he's really trying to do is he wants to move our focus away from the miracle to the significance of what the oil is all about, which we'll see at the end of the next chapter, at the end of the chapter, chapter 4, which is the next chapter, which is about light. He's much more interested in the outcome of the oil than in the miracle of the oil lasting 8 days, that event. You see, that's the problem. We get all caught up in the story. We say it's not believable. How could it happen? And we ignore what it's really all about. So Maimonides wants to get us focused on what it's really all about, not about the fact that it lasted for 8 days. All right, it lasted for 8 days. No, okay. In Yiddish, you would say, Grace Gedulis. Okay, and because of this, paragraph 3, accordingly. So the Hebrew is because of this. Now, I'm not sure I know what because of this is. It's possible that this is because he said that it lit for 8 days. But why is that significant enough that the candelabrum lit for 8 days to have an 8-day celebration? Unless what he's saying is as a way of celebrating the dedication of the temple, and this is linked to what we studied last week, that dedication of the temple ceremonies in the Bible were 7 days and 8 days, and it's possible, as we read in the reworked version of the old tradition of what's called the Skolion, that it took them a time to reconstruct the altar which had been defiled and to purify the vessels in the temple. So it took 8 days, and in commemoration of those 8 days, they celebrated, or they had that tradition, which was sort of an underground tradition by the Middle Ages, since they didn't have the Book of Maccabees, that somehow Hanukkah and Sukkot and the Feast of Booths were linked, and therefore it's an 8-day festival. And we know the Feast of Booths has to do with sacrifice. The temple in Solomon's time was dedicated around the time of Sukkot. So it's really about dedication. Hanukkah means dedication. Accordingly, the sages of that generation ordained that these 8 days, which begin from the 25th of Kislev, should be commemorated to be days of happiness and praise of God. Praise of God, that's what you miss in the English, means Hallel. And this is a big deal. In other words, the Rambam says that the rabbis enacted that for Hanukkah we should say the Hallel prayer. But the Hallel prayer is recited only on days in which there are sacrifices in the temple for miracles in which God's intervening hand is evident, and it's recited for all the pilgrim festivals, for Passover, for Feast of Weeks, for Sukkot. How come it's celebrated? How come it is recited and chanted on Hanukkah? That's an exception, and that's what he's emphasizing here. It may relate to the Sukkot celebration. It may relate to some spontaneous outpouring of joy on the part of the Judeans who dedicated the temple, and it does have to do with the joy of the temple, whether or not it was a supernatural miracle, which Maimonides is not going to push. Candles should be lit in the evening at the entrance to the houses on each and every one of those 8 nights to publicize and reveal the miracle. What's going on here? Here he is avoiding saying the miracle. Now, what miracle? What's he talking about? Which miracle? Is it the victory? What is he talking about? So I need you, let me read the next sentence. These days are called Hanukkah. It is forbidden to eulogize and fast, right? We know that, lighting the candles on these days. is a rabbinic mitzvah. Oh, we'll get to that later. All right. Can you please scroll down to which I think it's source number 5. Source number 5. Okay. Okay. So this is the text of Maimonides from a manuscript.
Thank you very much.
I'll read it to
Very
you.
good.
Same text that we have.
Thank you.
Accordingly, the sages of that generation, this is the third paragraph, third law in chapter 3. The sages of that generation ordained that these 8 days, which begin from the 25th of Kislev, should be commemorated to be days of happiness and praise of God. Candles should be lit in the evening at the entrance to the houses on each and every one of these 8 nights. These days are called Hanukkah. Missing is to reveal the miracle. So the original text of Maimonides did not have miracle. The manuscript version of Maimonides, the oldest manuscript that we have, does not mention the miracle. So this is consistent with our understanding of Maimonides. It was, that you have a tradition, and there's a great Yiddish saying called "Verteidigt verbessert." The printers are responsible for trying to make Jewish texts better than they were. Right? So scholars wrote texts, and people who were setting type, I shouldn't, they weren't unlearned. I mean, especially in the early days, the people who set the type also determined the text. I mean, they were learned, but they weren't the writers of the texts. They decided themselves that it must be this way, because how could he be describing Hanukkah without talking about it being a miracle? But that's exactly what he's trying to do. And he's trying to get us to understand that the miracle is a spiritual idea, not an interventionist idea, not a supernatural idea, not a change in somehow in the norms. It's a way of understanding. And that its significance is that if we have a religious worldview, we can come to a sense that all of nature itself is miraculous, because that's the goal, to have an awareness that we are blessed by being part of creation. And that awareness grows if we don't attribute special events to the supernatural, as if it's only in the supernatural that somehow there's something special, and that waking up in the morning and breathing isn't special. Who doesn't know today that waking up in the morning and breathing isn't special? I mean, who doesn't know that it's not special, that it's special, right? Every one of us knows that, because we also know people who can't breathe any longer. So that's the point. And that's what Maimonides wants to drive home. Stop this dependence. You're intoxicated. You're people who are seduced, and you are dependent, right? You're addicted to miracles, because that's the only way you understand religion. Get rid of miracles and understand religion as a teaching and as something that makes demands on you and a way of looking at the world. These days they're called Hanukkah, etc. Let's go back to the text, to the last phrase of the text. I'm sorry, I have it here actually. It is forbidden to eulogize and fast on them as on the days of Purim. Lighting the candles on these days is a rabbinic mitzvah, like the reading of the Megillah. So here Maimonides does something wonderful. He links Hanukkah to Purim. Why does he link it to Purim? Both are festivals that were achieved not by God, but by human beings. Purim by Mordechai and Esther, and Hanukkah by the Hasmoneans, and both are festivals that were achieved by human beings that are given a religious overtone, even a sense of the miraculous overtone, something special, that there was a spiritual transformation that occurred as a result of both events. Both of them are, as I said, rabbinic holidays, and I always like to quote Elie Wiesel, who said about certain events. He said as follows: there are many things in history that happened but are not true, and there are many things that didn't happen but are true. So both Purim and Hanukkah share the fact that historically the stories are dubious. The stories of Esther and Mordechai don't have a historical base. The story of the vial of oil certainly has no source even. It's much later than the events themselves. yet their significance, they do have significance in that the values that they transmit are something worthwhile, and that's a truth. It's a truth, right? The truth of Hanukkah is that in the end, light triumphs over darkness. I mean, it's maybe it's a self-evident truth, but the truth of Hanukkah, we'll see in a moment. We'll see how the Rambam unfurls this truth in a very profound way. But what we started with was a very important truth, that religious communities have to be the bearers of a tradition that put a halt to the excess use and abuse of power. That's the role of religion. I don't know that religion, not that I don't know, religion is not playing its role. Right? There's a famous story, by the way, of a conversation between Yeshayahu Leibovitz and Ben Gurion. I think I've mentioned it before. Yeshayahu Leibovitz was the ultimate critic and cynic, and he said to Ben Gurion, "How come you have a chief rabbi, Ben Gurion? You're a secular leader. Israel's a secular state. Why do you want a chief rabbi?" So Ben Gurion told Leibovitz, "I want the chief rabbi to be my chief rabbi," because Ben Gurion understood that if the chief rabbi were independent, then maybe the chief rabbi would be a threat to the political leadership, because it would offer a criticism, a critique. Instead, if the chief rabbi is part of the infrastructure, right, as part of the establishment, then the chief rabbi reflects the values and the image of the establishment structure itself. And that's exactly where religion should not be. And that's what we're facing today. That's one of the struggles that we have today in America, how to unravel the intersection of religion and state. Today here in Israel, it's a problem. It's still a problem worldwide. We haven't resolved this problem. You know, and the French think they've resolved it. You know, they declared laïcité, so you know religion is out. But you know they're confronting it on their own doorsteps themselves. So it's at our, you know, it's right there, and we constantly have to respond. And we need our religious teachings and our teachers to be part of this public discussion in terms of our learning how appropriately to respond, and the idea of self-limitation. All right, let's move on. Let's see the last three paragraphs in the next chapter. If we can move back to page number, please, to source number, what source number is it? 1? Yeah, to Maimonides, source number 1, please. Back. Okay. All right. Go up. Here. Okay. All right. Here we are. The mitzvah of kindling Hanukkah lamps is very dear, says Maimonides. This is chapter 4. So he's finishing up his teaching. Paragraph 12. By the way, in between chapter 3, paragraph 3, and chapter 4, paragraph 12, Maimonides articulates the laws of reciting Hallel. That's a problem. Why does Maimonides choose the laws of Hanukkah, which have a very tenuous relationship to Hallel, as the place in which to talk about Hallel? Because it's precise, you know, Hallel belongs with the laws of the holidays, Yom Tov, not in Hanukkah. Yet the end of chapter 3 is all devoted to elaborate presentation of the laws of Hanukkah. What's he doing? Precisely, it needs to be in Hanukkah, because Hanukkah requires a consciousness of the divine in order to be able to deal with all the elements of both the supposed miracle of the oil and the bravery of the Hasmoneans, the gevurah, the courageousness, the victory of the Hasmoneans. That, in other words, the victory has to be contextualized in a Hallel context, which ascribes the ultimate to the presence of God, to some sort of divine awareness. So that's what the Hallel brings, and that's why it's important in the context of Hanukkah. So Rambam continues, the mitzvah of kindling Hanukkah lamps is very dear. A person should be very careful in its observance to publicize the miracle. Again, he mentions miracle. And the miracle, I would say here, is not about the miracle of the oil. The miracle is God's presence. It's God's presence. And thus increase, right, because he says it right here, increase our praise of God and our expression of thanks. It's about gratitude. That's the point. If you want to talk about a miracle, it's about nurturing a sense of blessing and gratitude. So we say that even events that we achieve, isn't it amazing what's been achieved? Thank God it was achieved. A way of understanding that the achievements that we have and the good fortune that we have in life is a blessing, because that allows us to relate to other people in a sense of sharing with them, because we're part of we all share in God's blessing. And in its observance to publicize the miracle and thus increase our praise of God and our expression of thanks for the miracles which he wrought on our behalf. Now, I also want to say a word. Most of us who have a sense of who Maimonides is will say right away, well, he's known as a rationalist. I think that it's striking that a rationalist, who usually you might identify with sort of Kantian rationalism, is so devout. I mean, he's extremely devout. David Hartman used to tell us that Maimonides was God intoxicated. And I said this to my friend David Myers the other day, because he was asking me about all the hallelujahs, why we praise God so much. So I said to him that we praise God so much because if we wouldn't be praising God so much, we would be praising ourselves so much. And God sort of allows God's self to be the object of our praise, so that it's not self-adulation, because arrogance is the worst. Arrogance is idolatry. Arrogance is the worst sin, and it's what ruins people. It's what ruins people, what ruins relationship, and what ruins governments. And right. And so this is really the road that Maimonides is taking. Even if a person has no resources for food except what he receives from charity, he should pawn or sell his garments and purchase oil and lamps to kindle them in fulfillment of the mitzvah. I can only say the following, that the reason that the tradition is willing to go to such an extreme and say that even poor people should light the Hanukkah lamp is that poor people also need hope. They need to see the light dispelling the darkness. They need to understand that there are possibilities. And therefore, the sense, the chance of inspiring, of lighting some sense of hope in people's hearts by their lighting the candles and in celebration is something worthwhile. Heschel wrote a beautiful essay. It's a eulogy to East European Jewish life, in which he talks about the poverty of Eastern Europe, and which he talks about how the poor people looked forward to Shabbat, and how poor Jews who had nothing felt like kings and queens on Shabbat. That's what the Rambam is talking about here. You have to light the candles in order to develop, to nurture a sense of hope. And okay, that's enough to say about that. Okay, to continue. When a person has only a single pruta, and he's required to fulfill both the mitzvot of sanctifying the Sabbath day and lighting the Hanukkah lamp, he should give precedence to purchasing oil to kindle the Hanukkah lamp over purchasing wine to recite Kiddush. All right, so sanctifying the Sabbath day in Hebrew is Kiddush. Now, how come the Hanukkah lamp takes precedence over the recitation of Kiddush? Okay, because Kiddush doesn't have to be Kiddush, which is, by the way, considered to be a biblical commandment, need not be recited over wine. I don't know if people know that. You can recite Kiddush over bread. So you don't need wine for the Kiddush. Since you don't need wine and the obligation to wine is only rabbinic, so Hanukkah candles, which is also only rabbinic, takes precedence over Shabbos Kiddush. But Shabbos is a more regular holiday, is something that's more frequent. So shouldn't frequency take precedence over Hanukkah? So what the Rambam is saying, that because here he says, where is it? Even though wine, since both of these mitzvot are rabbinic in origin, it is preferable to give precedence to the kindling of the Hanukkah lamp, for it commemorates the miracle. All right. So in other words, the miracle it's of Kiddush Hashem. It sanctifies God's name. Again, I want to stress in the passage where Maimonides is talking about the oil, there he avoids talking about miracle. When he wants to talk about the significance of Hanukkah and of publicizing God's role, he calls that a miracle. So that's the miracle. The miracle is publicizing God against publicizing human power. That's what he wants. That's why he calls it a miracle, as an offset, as a way of limiting, not because he believes there was supernatural intervention in any direct attributable anthropomorphic way. Now, the other thing I want to say here, we don't have time to deal with it, but you have the source. There's a classic question here. If Hanukkah lamps and Shabbos lamps are rabbinic, that means they emerge as obligations in the rabbinic period, in the Talmudic period, right? In our current era, right? How come when we recite a blessing, we say, Asher Kishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, who sanctified us with his commandments? How did God sanctify us with a commandment to light Hanukkah candles? Hanukkah is not in the Bible. God didn't command us to light Hanukkah candles. So every one of us who lights Hanukkah candles, what is the tradition demanding that somehow it's an untruth, right? That we recite. So the passage from the Talmud that I brought is a famous passage in Tractate Shabbat, which says in Deuteronomy it says that you have to in each when there is an issue that you have for which there is no settled agreement as to what the law is, you have to go ultimately to Jerusalem, to the court of that day, and the judge will render judgment. The judge, Asher Yeh Bayamim Hahem, the judge of that particular time. So the Talmud says, and this is an important sort of a doctrine, an important doctrine, that rules introduced by rabbis have a sense of authority of Torah, even though they were introduced by rabbis. The other side of that is that what the tradition recognizes is that Judaism is elastic and Judaism grows, and the attribution of God's authority to a human, what we call a human law, the divine in the human, should not be wielded as a weapon to claim that the law is immutable and absolute. But on the contrary, the awareness that we have, that we're consciously saying that observances that were developed in the rabbinic period are attributed to God, suggests to me that the tradition recognizes that maybe that's what our tradition is based on. Traditions of people that are attributed to God, and that the attribution to God is a way of giving them value, not of giving them ultimacy. And to give them some sense of authority, because you do need a structure with authority, and that there's also a hierarchy in how the law is developed. But again, it's a question of consciousness, not a question of fact. There's no fact here. God said it. God didn't say it. Clearly, the Hasmoneans said, light the candles. God didn't say light the candles. Or the Hasmoneans introduced the practice. The Talmud says light the candles, right? But we say you commanded us. That's I want to look upon that, not in the absolutist way, but I want to look upon it in the creative way. This is an aspect of the creativity of Judaism that's part of the development of a religion that Maimonides promotes in the way in which he does. Okay, so that's 13. Let's see now the final paragraph. Okay, can you scroll down, Giselle, please? If a person has the opportunity to fulfill only one of two mitzvot, lighting a lamp for one's home, the Sabbath candles, or lighting a Hanukkah lamp, is a famous passage in the Talmud, or alternatively, lighting a lamp of one's home or reciting Kiddush. Now, a lamp in one's home is, right, Shabbos candles, right? The lamp of one's home receives priority since it generates peace within the home. Wow. So what Maimonides says as follows. Even though in the prior paragraph we said that Hanukkah candles take precedence over Kiddush, over wine, because Hanukkah candles proclaim and publicize God's presence, right? Nevertheless, when it comes to Shabbos candles versus Hanukkah candles, and you don't have enough money for both of them, Shabbos candles takes precedence over Hanukkah candles. Now, once again, the Talmud doesn't say because Shabbos candles are more frequent. The Talmud says because of peace in the household. What's the Talmud driving at, and what's Maimonides want to achieve here? We want to say the following, and I'm going to sort of list a number of conclusions that we draw. Number one, the home takes precedence over politics and over the public domain. The home is the crucible of peace. Politics don't achieve peace. Parents, love between people achieves peace, and the way in which people live with one another. So lighting Shabbos candles, shalom bayit, the love of Shabbos, induces a sense of connectivity between people. We have to generate that, and if we create cells of homes filled with Shabbos, with peace, it doesn't have to be Shabbos peace, well, with peace, it reverberates beyond. I think that we can say that sociologically that's true. That's a main challenge that we have, how to achieve this sense of peace in the household that people can then live with and then share beyond them, number one. Number two, peace is the goal here, not zealotry, the strategy. Here it's both a goal and a strategy. The strategy is compromise and peace. Shalom bayit. Shalom bayit. Let me mention a practice of Yemenite Jews that I came across in a book that Shalom Sabar edited. And I had never heard this practice. I'm sorry, it's Moroccan Jews. It used to be a custom in Morocco that on Friday night, just after candle lighting, husband and wife would sit together for a glass of tea. And the ritual of drinking a glass of tea with one another was called Boi Kala, come my bride. And they would review the week with one another. They would start Shabbos by talking about what bothered them, what went well. They would allow the week to pass through them in reflection so that they could bind their souls to one another in a peaceful Shabbat. That's the exercise of how to engage in lighting Shabbos candles. It's not about the ritual of Shabbos candles. It's how you light a light in your heart. I mean, it's extremely powerful. Let me say, I'm going to jump the gun here a little bit. I'll come back to, and maybe I'll repeat it again later. Maimonides is giving us the deepest understanding of Hanukkah candles. You think Hanukkah candles is about a miracle. You think Hanukkah candles is about a victory. Hanukkah candles is about lighting a light in the community, in the people, and illuminating people with wisdom. It's an inner light, not an external light. What Maimonides is doing in this teaching is he's converting Hanukkah candles into Shabbos candles by saying that Shabbos candles take precedence over Hanukkah candles. All right? Let me just go on in terms of articulating some of the conclusions we can draw from this passage about how Shabbos candles take precedence over Hanukkah candles. What Maimonides is saying is that if you go to war, and you have to go to war, the goal of war is Shabbos candles. It's peace, not victory. Victory cannot be the goal of war, because victory means one side has defeated the other, and you never forget that. That's a zero-sum way of understanding things. The ultimate goal if you have to go to war is to reach the point of compromise, which hopefully you can get to before you go to war. All right? The purpose of the war is to spread the light and to bring illumination and wisdom. What you have here as a strategy articulated by Maimonides is a prejudice. Now, it's a conservative prejudice. It basically says that Shabbos candles, gradual change, mitzvot, small things that you do, what I would call tikkun olam practice. Tikkun olam practice is not solving the grand problems of the universe, because you can't solve the grand problems of the universe if you don't have peace in your own home. So you have to solve little problems, and you have to sort of work at them constantly in order to be able to bring about change. That change is more lasting than the victory, than the great revolution, than the revolution of the Maccabees. Maimonides is a gradualist, Mitzvot are a gradual formula for bringing about change in the world. Extremely frustrating for people who want there to be change. But the way to do so, it's the disciplined way to do so in a way that you actually bring people along constantly. And every once in a while, there's a jump ahead. But if you try to jump ahead and achieve the Maccabean revolt, then ultimately you eat up yourself. That's what happens time and time again. You have to be very careful with revolution if you engage in a revolution, because at what point are you able to then restrain yourself from the revolutionary zeal and sort of bring it back into a gradual mode that's going to bring about change in a peaceful way, or are you going to continue to execute your opponents in the guillotine? I mean, that occurs time after time after time that we have to be careful about. Okay, what time is it? Because I've lost sense of time. What time is it?
It is 6:25.
Oh my God! All right, peace is of primary importance, as reflected. So, by the way, I want you to notice this already. Rambam began chapter 3 talking about war. He ends chapter 4 talking about peace. Not only does he end chapter 4 talking about peace, I understand this unbelievable reversal. He establishes here peace is of primary importance, reflected in the mitzvah requiring God's name to be blotted out to create peace between a husband and wife. I'll get to that in a moment. Peace is great, for the entire Torah was given to bring about peace within the world, as it states, its ways. This is magic. This is true magic. The context of military victory of the Hasmoneans, the defeat of the Seleucid Greeks, the rise to power and the abuse of power on the part of the Greeks ultimately leads Maimonides to a conclusion which turns Hanukkah upside down and makes Hanukkah the context in which he declares that the purpose of Torah is to teach peace, universal peace to the world. How about that? In other words, it's about, that's what I call a programmed methodology to take a particular event of the redemption of the Jewish people and the liberation of the Jews and say, we won, and say the significance of our victory cannot be just that we won. It can't be that we were able to save our religion. Thank God, but it has to be something greater. So the purpose of our victory is for us to learn and internalize our responsibility for bringing light to the world. That's what Hanukkah is really all about. And to generating a greater understanding of the goal that all humans share, which is a partnership in bringing about universal peace. And the Torah is our way of seeking out that goal. You think the Torah is just about a narrow-minded Jewish way of living. That's the form of the Torah. But the significance, the inner significance of the Torah is a universal desire to bring about an ultimate resolution to conflict all over the world, because its ways are ways of peace. What an elevating message. And look how he reaches it. He said, God's self was willing to forego God's pride. What Maimonides understands is that pride is the source, pride and ego. It's a source of conflict. People fight wars over a sense of their own ownership and their sense of power and their own sense of importance and their need to control. So God says, I'm willing to give up my sense of importance. And for the sake of peace, if a husband accuses his wife, this is a biblical law, it's an ordeal, and it's not pleasant, and it needs, and it rightfully deserves critique. But look at what Maimonides does with it. The Talmud says that the ritual of the ordeal is that the woman who's accused by her husband of being unfaithful comes to the temple. The priest writes out the verse on a piece of parchment, dips the verse in some sacred water, and the name of God is erased. And then the woman drinks that water, and if nothing happens to her after she drinks the water, then she and husband go back to live together. That is, they are reconciled with one another, meaning the following. And husband accepts this. Emmanuel Rackman wrote an article about this. This is a psychological ordeal. And if the woman understands that she's not guilty, she'll drink the water and nothing will happen because there's no magic. And once she drinks the water, once she drinks the water in the context of a world in which people believed in magic, right? And then what happened is that God sort of sacrificed God's honor by allowing God's name to be erased, which is a biblical violation of the 10 Commandments, to erase God's name for the sake of maintaining peace between a man and woman, husband and wife. And the lesson in Maimonides is, if God can represent to you the model of tzimtzum, of contraction, of limiting his power, of restraint, of suppressing God's pride, so too can you do that. And if you can do that, then you'll understand what Hanukkah is all about, and then you'll understand what the Torah is all about. The Torah is a teaching that's intended to deflate the human ego and to give it it's not about our less sense of value. On the contrary, it's an alternate sense of value. It's about learning what's important and elevated is not the things that we control or that we think that we control. It's about a different way of looking at the world and about ultimate values that are important, and we know all about it. Bob said it earlier. Every one of us has a greater sense of our mortality, especially those of us on the older scale, I think, but all of us, given this pandemic. So we should be able to garner more energy in bringing to bear on our interpersonal relationship a greater sense of humility. That's what this calls for. We don't have it in our leadership. So the people, now hopefully our president-elect has a sense that one feels a sense of humility. It's so necessary in leadership. It's a model for people. It's a way in which people let down their guard a little bit and open themselves up to others. So the point here is, can we live a Torah that carries the flag of peace and bring that peace forward into the world? Now, I have some things in the packet. It's late. I do want to show one more thing, and then we'll bring it to a conclusion. I'm not going to read the poetry about contemporary Israel. You can read it on your own. You'll see how the revival of the state of Israel, or the rebuilding of the state of Israel, required the reassertion of the Hanukkah victory of the Maccabees and the marching military victoriousness, and the contrast between the Israeli songs and the Psalms, and how the words of the Psalms, Mi Yimalel Gvurot Hashem, who will articulate the bravery of God or the strength of God, is translated Mi Yimalel Gvurot Yisrael, who will articulate the greatness or the great achievements, the bravery of Israel. So and on and on. There are other examples, but so I would say to you the following: that in our modern era, remember, if I didn't make it clear, Maimonides doesn't reject power completely. He understands that there are times that power needs to be manifest. What he says is that I want you to develop a reservoir of restraint that you could bring to bear in your lives when you do have to exercise power. Can you give Giselle? Can you just remove? Don't remove the packet from the screen. Okay, good. Okay. That there are times in our history that we do have to make use of our power, and the revolution of Zionism called for an expression of that power. The challenge to us is, having achieved that revolution, can we recall the reservoir of those teachings to counteract our obsession with what we've achieved, and understand the need to somehow sustain a balance in which in which both sides somehow control to one another and limit one another, so that we not lose completely the sense that sometimes sometimes might is needed, but that it's not might alone that is our ultimate goal, not by might and not by power alone, I would say, but by the Spirit. We need to integrate the Spirit. So the way in which if you can move on now to page number 9, I just want to show you, I mean, there are a whole series of examples, but just look at the, back, page 9. All right, this is too far, all right. Right here, this page, the colored page. Okay, so this is the Cervera Bible. This is the photo that I took in Lisbon. The Bible itself was designed and produced in Spain in 1300. It's a manuscript. It includes this very famous picture of the menorah, something you should recognize. The menorah itself is a stylized tree. What we have on the sides of the tree are 2 olive trees. The olive trees are yielding oil into the cups, and the 2 cups, the 2 olive trees represent the Zerubbabel, whom you might call the secular leader, and Yehoshua, the high priest. So this is a sharing of power where there was a partnership between the government and religious leadership, in which each one and separately had some check on the other, and they both contribute oil to the menorah, which through 7 pipes. This is a fulfillment of Zechariah's prophecy. So look at this. The menorah is a stylized, as I said, is a stylized tree. What it is in this picture is the resolution of nature, the trees, and culture. And the ultimate, what I would say, the ultimate reconciliation of the forces of the world, it seems to be represented by Hanukkah. In conclusion, and let me draw here on the Rambam. What is this sort of resolution that's represented here? I mean, you have, somehow the spirit emerging out of nature itself. That is the Hanukkah lamp, linked to the trees that are the source of the oil. Now, the great divide occurred in the Garden of Eden, where we ate of the tree of knowledge and we left behind the tree of life. What happens on Hanukkah symbolically is that the tree of knowledge and the tree of life are merged, and that what we understand is that knowledge itself has to be the key to life. That knowledge itself has to be not just intellectual knowledge, but it's knowledge that brings light. It's also spiritual knowledge. And so not only a knowledge that comes from without, but a knowledge that comes from within. There's wisdom that we gain from without, and wisdom that emerges from within all of us. So Hanukkah becomes then a fountain of spiritual spiritual resources that we bring into the world, and that allow us to have a type of ultimate, an aspiration for unity in the world in which we live. What we learn from the Rambam, to conclude, is that Shabbos is the essential teaching that and carries within it the heart of what Hanukkah is all about: peace in the household. That victory is not the ultimate goal, but peace is the ultimate goal. That instead of pride alone, we should learn to limit our pride and foregoing our honor at times. Zealotry leads to destruction. Compromise leads to peace. Matityahu killed the heretic, right? Aaron, the high priest, brought peace between husband and wife, between conflicting parties. So it's the priesthood of Aaron that, it seems to me, is the eternal priesthood, and Matityahu's priesthood was the priesthood for the moment. And the home becomes the central crucible in which we're going to generate a living life that's going to transmit the values that we want, really, that are transformative, and that we have work to do, all of us, in terms of generating that light together. Happy Hanukkah to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Chaim.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chaim.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chaim.
Thank you so much.
Beautiful.
Thank you. Happy Hanukkah.
Happy
You all have peace in your homes.
Chag Sameach.
Hanukkah.
Yes,
Sameach.
Chag Urim Sameach, the great festival of light for all.
Chag Urim Sameach.
Urim
Gam
Sameach.
lecha, gam lecha.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Love from New York.
Everyone,
Take
Amen.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Mariana,
This
hi
was so
Mariana.
great.
Say something. You're hiding.
Great that I
Yes,
get
you
to
are.
do this in San Francisco. It's so great. It's what we dreamed of, or what I dreamed of.
Thank you for joining. Thank you.
Really
The silver
wonderful.
lining.
We're sending our love from BJ.
Oh, yes, right here. Same here. Good. We have few of
Ron,
us here.
shalom, Ron. I hear your
Shalom,
voice.
shalom, shalom,
Yes.
shalom.
And Marie from BJ too.
Ah,
Love from
hello, Marie.
BJ.
Lois from
And Shelly,
BJ.
Shelly Ostro is there too. Shelly, I see.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're all part of your
I feel it.
students. We learn so much with you. Always do.
Abby.
Sei gesund.
Sei gesund. A freilich Hanukkah. A freilich Hanukkah.
Have you heard of the book by Dov Zinger, Prepare for Prayer? Dov Zinger, the friend of Rodi Matalon in Israel. Have you heard? Have you bought the book?
No, what's the book? I don't know what the book is.
Prepare for Prayer. Dov Zinger.
Dov Zinger. Oh, yes, I have. Yes, I have the book. Yes, I have the book.
It's a beautiful.
Teaching right before you. Were you there, Ron, at Rowley's?
Yeah.
I know I couldn't
Here's
do
the book,
both.
Ron. Here's the book. Tikkun
That's the
Tzilati.
one.
Here's the book in Hebrew.
I think it's wonderful.
No, it is.
Rowley was teaching right before you, Chaim.
Ah, okay.
We got the both of you. Much love. Bye-bye.
So look. Hi, Andy. How are you doing, Andy?
Oh, I'm well, Chaim. A delight to learn with you.
Thank you.
I was there.
Where are you? I don't know where you